It's the Big Ten and the Pac-12 back at it at the Holiday Bowl in San Diego with Minnesota taking on Washington State. Last season, Wisconsin, USC, kind of a similar matchup with USC having on the surface, on paper, the more dynamic players and being a substantial favorite. Wisconsin grinding out the victory with solid defense, the ground game, and precision passing. Of course, it's Minnesota and it's Washington State, both teams at 8-4. Check out who Minnesota has lost to and by what margin. Penn State, Iowa, Nebraska, and Wisconsin. Two of those four teams, two of the top 8 teams in the country. The other two, not bad, Nebraska and Iowa, especially the Hawkeyes late in the season. And Minnesota lost all those games by 1 score. Washington State could have won the Pac-12 North Division, but they lost a late-season game against Colorado. They still could have won it, but they lost the Apple Cup to the Huskies. Okay, the big factor in this game is, of course, Luke Falk's passing, 37 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, one of the very best in the nation against a Minnesota secondary that is extremely good when it has its full contingent. But 10 Minnesota players suspended. Here are the guys that matter. Antoine Winfield Jr. Yes, that Antoine Winfield, the son of the Ohio State and Minnesota Viking great. Starting safety, 4th on the team in total tackles with 52, 2.5 tackles for loss and a pick. He will be missed. The other 3 players of note, all in the starting cornerback rotation. Keontae Harden, Antonio Chenot, and Ray Buford. Buford had 16 tackles this season. He's the least of the factors. Chenot with 32 total tackles. Harden in the return game had 16 returns, both punt and kickoff returns. And in the secondary, 39 stops, 3 tackles for loss, and 2 interceptions. That's key against this Washington State team that actually has improved because they're a better rush team on offense and a better run team on defense. Believe it, Washington State is 3rd in the Pac-12 against the run and taking on a Minnesota team that's going to want to grind it out, run the clock, and keep possession of the football. So for Washington State, you've got guys like Peyton Pelor with 89 total tackles to lead the team. Hercules Mataafa, who had 4 sacks and 12.5 tackles for loss, and their senior starting safety, who is a real leader on this team, Shalom Luani, with 4 interceptions. He had 8.5 tackles for loss and 58 total tackles. 3rd best rushing defense in the Pac-12. That's a bit surprising to most people, taking on a Minnesota team that wants to run, and with Shannon Brooks, 15 rushing touchdowns, 22 passes out of the backfield, and over 1,000 yards. Of course, they also have, that's actually Rodney Smith, the number 1 tailback, backed up by Shannon Brooks, who ran it for 600 yards and 5 touchdowns, and Mitch Leidner, the quarterback, keeps it on the zone read a ton of times, and he's a guy that also moves it out of the pocket when he can't find a receiver, and ran it for 10 touchdowns. Minnesota limited in the passing game. Leidner had more interceptions than touchdowns. They're going to have to find some room in the passing game, especially to the tight end, their leading receiver. Washington State, much better under Mike Leach because of what we just mentioned. Rushing defense, surprisingly, and also rushing offense. Guys like Jamal Morrow, who leads the team with 6.5 yards per carry. He also has 562 yards rushing, 5 touchdowns. James Williams, another guy out of the backfield, 573 yards and 6 touchdowns. And it's also actually Gerard Wicks, who leads the team with 11 touchdowns on the ground. Go back about 3 years and check out Washington State's numbers. They threw it 70 times a game practically every time out, and they could not run it for more than 2.5 yards per carry. Their rushing stats were paltry, and they were barely getting to bowl games or going 3-9 like Mike Leach's first season. This is a better team because they can actually run the ball and they balance it out. Yeah, they sure still want to throw it 60-40 ratio, but it's a balanced offense for Washington State, and it's actually a defense that has a little bit of will and tenacity, unlike some Cougars teams of the past that actually they want to tackle and get their nose into the fray. Washington State taking on Minnesota. It's a lot of things that we could run down here. Minnesota very dependable in field goal kicking with Emmett Carpenter, 41 of 42 on extra points, 21 of 23 on field goals. And Minnesota, again, a top 30 scoring defense against Washington State. The Cougars have the glitz. They have the glamour. They have the playmakers on the outside, the guys that we've seen a number of times in these games like Gabe Marks that are going to be difficult for this Minnesota secondary, depleted Minnesota secondary to contain. I still like the Gophers to keep it close, within the 10.5. Washington State 30, Minnesota 24. Take Minnesota plus the 10.5 points, or maybe it goes beyond that in the next couple of days. But Washington State wins it. Need to hear from you now. Pac-12, Big Ten in the Holiday Bowl right here on Mark Rogers TV.